Hello and welcome to the podcast Let's Talk Sexuality by Tathapi Trust, the podcast that brings to you stories on relationship and sexuality.
So hi once again, this is Peter from the Storytellers and glad to have you back with us. Today we are recording a story based on Shashi Deshpande's The Story. Today's storyteller is Elaine and she will be telling us the story from the point of view of the granddaughter. Normally the story is told by a mother to the daughter, but Elaine has a grandmother and this is the grandmother's story. So hi Elaine, happy to have you with us.
Hi Peter.
So let's listen to the story.
This story was told to me by my grandmother. Now that's a little unusual because it's usually handed down from mother to daughter. When I spoke to my grandmother about listening to the story, she said, "Well, your mother should have told you, but my daughter, she didn't believe in the story, so she didn't even want to listen to it."
Okay.
So, she said that her mother had told her that when the red mark of womanhood shows on your body, that is the time you should hear the story. And she said, "Your mother should have told you this, but your mother is a strange girl." She was always afraid of the blood. She didn't want to cross over. She didn't want to grow up and become a woman. So, she didn't tell you the story, but I am going to tell you. The story is an old one. It began when the world was very young. And people think that the world was very perfect when it started. It wasn't. It was an imperfect world. The story says that it had its dark flaws. It had old age and it had sickness. And of course, it had suffering and death. People usually think that the imperfections came along with time. But even though it was an imperfect world, it was a good world. The people in it were in things together. Men and women shared everything. There was no greater, smaller. There was no yours and mine. Everything was ours. They had their share of work. He did his work and she did hers. Of course, the women gave birth to the children and suckled the young. But everything else was shared. They were good friends and comrades. And that's how the world was. And then suddenly, things began to change. It began with this dream, actually, a fantasy of eternal life. And it began because there was a seed of bitterness. Why should people have to die? Why should we leave this world? And more than that, there was fear. The fear that what would happen after death? Where do we go? Some said that the ruler had begun these stories for reasons of his own. And the whispers began like leaves gently falling from a tree.
Okay, it's kind of thing, the supreme being
Yes,
or a god.
yes, absolutely. Some kind of supreme being. Okay. And he started these rumors for reasons of his own. And he said, yes, eternal life, if you want it, it's there. In a cave beyond the ocean. And if you want to look for it, go ahead. So, one day the men decided that they would go. Yes, it was the men. But they were all excited and the women were part of it. They were excited to send them off. And there was joy and singing and dancing. And the women had to stay back because there had to be someone to look after the children and the old and ailing. But later, the women realized that this had been a mistake. They should have gone along with the men to seek for things because I think they thought that different things would have come out of it. There would have been different results. Because isn't it true that you always find what you're looking for? Yeah. So the women stayed back and the men went off. They came back earlier than expected. And as soon as the women saw them, they knew that the trip had been a disaster. Most of the men looked ill. They lay exhausted as if dead. Their skin had become a strange color. They were coughing, and some were vomiting copiously, as if to bring their insides out.
But what happened?
Yes, a few of them could still speak, so they revealed what happened. Well, they had reached the cave, and there was a huge rock across the entrance, which, with great effort, they pushed aside. And then it happened. Poisonous gas gushed out and felled the people in front. The ones who had just smelt it ran away, and they came back later to drag the unconscious ones back. They were very, very poisoned, that's all. The poison had entered their bloodstream. After a few days, silence hung over the place, of course. They slowly recovered. Even the ones that they thought were going to die recovered. And then as they became better, they decided to go back. Now the women they were angry and they were a little sullen. Why would you want to go back when such a horrible thing had happened? But the men were determined. This time they weren't happy and jubilant and triumphant. They were going back as if it was a duty they had to do instead of a happy adventure. But this time the men returned safe. And they were triumphant because they brought back things. Yes, the women were a little puzzled. Why were they so happy about these shiny stones that they had brought back? They were no use. And they were pretty. Some were transparent, some were brightly colored. And yet, what were they going to do with them? But slowly, the magic of those stones took over the women. And they also started admiring them and looking at the way they shone and dazzled. And then, both the men and the women started gloating over these treasures. Now no more did they want to share it with everybody. The men, the stones they brought back, they would only share with the woman who was living with them at that time. And both of them would admire them in secret. The women would tell the men, "We want some more," and goad the men to go and get some. And then they would look down on the ones who didn't have so many. So it became an obsession. Each one had their collection, and each one became a source of pride, and they kept it to themselves. But there were other things that the men got back. Not everything was bad. They got back medicines for illnesses. But most of the things were these useless things which you could only hoard. You didn't use. They were baubles. And then, of course, they got back wine. And wine makes you forget. And they needed these moments of forgetfulness because there were no more moments to treasure. These things clouded their thinking. After all, the poison had not really left their bodies. They had gone into the bloodstream and made them greedy. And what about the women who stayed with them, who slept with them, who lay limb to limb? Wouldn't it affect them also? Now they should have learnt a lesson if their thinking had not been so influenced by the poison of what possessiveness does. Because they got back this beautiful Parijat tree. And they planted it, and the Parijat had flowers like stars with a heavenly fragrance. And they loved that tree. And yet, when any one of them wanted to possess the blossoms and collected them and made a garland, it would just turn to mush. And those little red stalks would be like drops of blood. And this is something that they should have realized, what happens when you want to own something. In the meantime, they had forgotten the real object of their search. It was not that they were just distracted. It was just that they'd got so busy with all these pleasures. And the thought of dying and death became secondary. After all, they were young and strong, and there were many more things to do besides thinking of this vague sense of immortality. And if someone did die, it was always, it was somebody else. It wasn't their turn. It would come later. Now, the next thing became very natural and easy. If you could own something, then you could certainly own a human being. But the women were astonished with what the men brought back next. What was this thing? It looked exactly like them, but not exactly. This female that they brought back, many females, were beautiful. They had long legs and small waists and high breasts and smooth skin and shiny hair. But the thing was that they all looked exactly the same. And even more strange was their behavior. The women really puzzled. They seemed to be smiling all the time. Well, they showed their teeth anyway. And it was always directed to the men. They made the men feel as if they were the most important thing in the world. And this the women found strange, because up to now the men were just another important thing in a whole lot of other stuff that was there. But the females, everything was about the men. They had to please the men. They had to do everything for them. And the men felt so important. And soon, each one of them got a man exclusively for herself. And she also started seeing that nobody else encroached on her man. Now they started keeping them to themselves, and the women, looking at them, felt there was something pathetic about the female's dependence on the man. But the men seemed to be enjoying it. So the women thought, why not us? And they started wanting to copy the female's behavior. Why shouldn't we have skins like them? Why shouldn't our bodies look like them? After all, the men are very happy. Why shouldn't we paint our skin and put on perfume and mask our body odor? Why not? So slowly the women started to change. They also became the exclusive possession of the man. And they started to fear the females and be suspicious of them. Now the men found their pleasures in the female they had brought home beginning to pall. They found this too much sweetness, very cloying, as if they were trapped in thick honey. And the relationship that they had with the women earlier, that didn't make them happy either. Why? Because they were not humble enough and subservient enough. So everything they valued, they felt that they were not being treated as if, they had some status. Everyone was unhappy and everyone wanted to change. And then one day, the men came back with something that left them all in an awed hush. She was spectacular. She was more than perfect. She was lovelier than the females and the women put together. And besides that, she had a soft, glowing aura about her. The men couldn't get over her. They would go around in circles and they would look at her with absolute, what can I say? They just longed for her in every way. And on top of her being perfect in beauty, she also had an innocence like a child. Now this made the men, though they desired her body, they made them feel as if they had to protect her.
So it was just one woman. This was just a single
That
woman.
was the whole problem.
Oh.
And she, besides the childlike innocence and besides the wonderful perfect beauty, she also had a motherliness that the women had. Now the women had that for the children, but this being had it for the men. So the men felt safe and they felt they could do no wrong. So it was everything in one. But as you said, Peter, there was only one of her. And they would be in a dream all night about her. Each man thought she would be the right partner for him. And she was meant for him. And he would go around the whole day also in this dream. She was like a fantasy, something that their dreams and desire had created. And she would just look at them with this inscrutable smile. She didn't have to do anything. They couldn't understand her, but it didn't matter. They didn't want to understand her. They loved the feelings she produced in them. So this was a heady combination of being both childlike and virile. They loved it. Now the women had turned into dull creatures for them, and the females were but poor substitute for everything that the being had promised. But one day, She just disappeared. Now nobody knew where she had gone. They thought maybe the ruler had called her back. Or maybe she had chosen the ruler because she was too perfect for any of them and only he deserved her. But even after she disappeared, the women and the men just longed for her. The women wanted to still be like her, even though she was just a fantasy. The females tried to be like her too. And the men would keep looking for her in both the women and the females and be horribly disappointed. Now nobody knows how all this, happened. The being vanished. But so strong and so pervasive was her influence that the women and the females continued to measure themselves with this yardstick of perfection. Her physical beauty, her gentleness, her motherliness, her charm. Without this, they felt lacking. And the women had forgotten that they had been creatures of their own. Now, this is why my grandmother said that she was telling me this story, so that she could keep this story alive, to tell people that women had not always been like this, dependent, slavish. And my grandmother said that this story should never be changed. But when she told me, her voice, her tone, her face, her little nuances and her little phrases changed the story. And when I tell it, I'm sure it's changed from the original. And she said, this feeling of wanting to be immortal or eternal life.
Oh, that's what I wanted to ask you. What happened to that search for immortality?
That
where this
somehow got forgotten along the way. At that time, people were still looking for it, but they became old and died. And the next lot, they were so busy gathering possessions, looking after them, then handing them over to their children, that they forgot about this search for eternal life, if there had been any. But my grandmother said that, where eternal life is, she had it. Because she lived through me. And I would live through my children. So the eternal life had always been there. And she said that there were still women who remembered how things had been. And there were still men who remembered how the women had been with them, independent creatures, proud to be what they were. And there were women today who would not change their nature for the world and would still remain the same and be friends and comrades and companions, equal share. And that is why the story is told from mother to daughter and should be kept on forever, I think.
Yeah, so the immortality part comes in also the storytelling.
Yes.
Passing the story on. From one
the story
generation.
lives forever. Yes, it does.
Okay, wow, that's quite a different kind of story for a change. So it seems very old, like somehow when you're telling the story, you feel that you've heard this sometime way back, but okay.
Yes, and when my grandmother told it, it was always as if the story had a life of its own. The story believes, the story tells, the story says. So that was her way of saying it. Maybe I've changed it now when I tell it again. But the story lives on.
Very interesting. A lot of those colored stones is like the discovery of money, and it's no longer
jewels, yes, wealth,
possessions, and wanting to have something when before it's a tribe and everything belongs to everyone. Now it's becoming like individual possessions, and very, very interesting story. So thank you Elaine, for this wonderful story, and thank you also to you, our listener out there. If you have any reactions to what you've been listening to, we'd be glad to hear them. And do keep listening to our stories as they keep coming up. Thank you once more.
This podcast is brought to you by Tathapi Trust Pune, a women and health organization. Be sure to give us your comments and suggestions for stories you want to hear on letstalksexuality.com. Stay healthy, stay safe, and have fun.